So here is my painting of the Violin Maker in their workshop, which I started last week and is now dry. The areas that I applied paint with card I've now got a dry surface. Just as a reminder of the ideas behind this process, this was the pastel study that I made in preparation for the painting. And if you recall, I put down areas of colour using the side of the pastel, avoiding any guiding lines, just blocking in areas of colour. And then there are places where I've just introduced a certain amount of line for definition. You can see it around the cello, on the violin case, the side of the violin. So I'm just pointing this out because this in a way is going to be the approach that I'll take with the painting. The paint applied with the card as a set of fairly loose, imprecise shapes. The paint is also thick, and what I want to do before I start painting, before I start adding definition, lines and so on, is I want to scrape down some of this thick paint that sticks out. And each time I do it, I'll do it colour by colour, because sometimes under the dry surface there can be still some wet paint. What tends to happen with oil paint is it forms a skin and hardens on contact with air, obviously over a certain amount of time. But it can be that under that skin the paint is still wet, and so I'm just trying to avoid spreading colour out to areas where I don't want it to be. But you can see there, I've not really lost the image. I've lost a certain amount of the raised texture of the paint. But it's to a small degree softening the image. Now, of course, you can do this scraping down when the paint is wet, and then you get a much softer result. But usually, and certainly when the paint is dry, you'll be left with a kind of slightly more ghostly image. And I suppose this, again, the parallel with the pastel approach, this is just really like smudging some pastel. So I'm doing it for two reasons. Firstly, to smudge the image a bit, and secondly, to give me I think a better surface that I can apply paint to. So I'm going to start with one or two lines, and then I'm going to refine the negative shapes around the figure using some pieces of card. So I'm beginning this process of adding some definition selectively. I've got a fine sable brush, and I've made one or two colours which are going to work with the blocks of colour that I laid down. So here a little bit of work for the luthier's shirt. So I'm introducing lines at the moment because I think that's probably the most relevant to these areas that I'm dealing with. So it's a certain amount of redrawing, but because I'm doing this redrawing onto these loosely applied colour shapes, I don't need to do probably as much drawing as I might if I were working in a different way. So I've got mixed a good dark for the hair as well. So this is refining. This painting that was started very loosely with a lot of paint applied in a relatively imprecise way, but because of that, slightly imprecise way of laying down shapes, there's probably more coherence to this image than there might be if I'd begun with, my thin brush trying to put down lines and points of definition. So working loosely in that broad approach with the card helps create a certain unity, structure to the painting. And so if I add these refinements as a second stage, then they're not going to take away that sort of unity, that integrity of the first steps. So I did a little bit to the shirt. I'm now attempting to refine hands and head a little bit. And I'll do one or two things to those violins. And then I'll start to work a bit with the negative shapes around the figure. So there's obviously a lot more I could be doing to my whole painting, to the rest of the workshop, but I'm just going to concentrate on these bits that I worked on last week. So now I'm back to working with card, and I've mixed up a colour that's pretty close to my original background colour, and I'm just working with the negative shapes around this figure. So there is a degree of tidying up, perhaps, but also just this business of seeing not the positive shape, in this case of the head, but actually the shape of what's around it. And that way I can refine the head, help it stand out. And there's a gap there, I might get a bit more scarf. So refining the head a little bit. And then what I think I'll do is I'll work a bit within the clothing. So I had put down some lines in her top. And now I want to kind of absorb some of those lines into the colour of that shirt. So I've made a darkish shirt colour, which I'll apply with the card. I could also have just obviously smudged those lines, even scraped them down. Because they're wet, they'll be softened. So that's a darker colour for the shirt. I've also made a lighter one, because I want to go on kind of modelling the figure a bit and introducing some contrast. So it probably would be good to apply a similar approach to the instruments, even to the hands. But I would take the same approach of putting down some lines first and then working to those lines or away from those lines, and deciding whether to keep the lines or to soften and lose them. So the refinements that I'm continuing to make with the pieces of card are now sort of smaller and more specific. For example, a little bit of light on the hair, just to break that up, to break up that dark shape. That's not quite making an impact. I've made a bit of a shadow colour for the face. So again, those lines that I introduced to the features, I would like to soften them a little bit, connect them with some tonal shapes so that I can introduce more and more modelling. And some colour for the violin. So that's maybe a point worth remaking, that having put down the lines, the refinements that I'm now making using the card are smaller and smaller, and I can cut pieces of card to size. I can also reintroduce the line at any point if that's going to be useful. And my final sort of judgment perhaps needs to be how many of these lines, these points of definition, do I want to keep, and how many should I remove? And that, of course, is all to do with emphasis. What do I want to stand out? With this particular theme, I'm interested in where the work, where the craftsperson's attention is on the instruments and so on. And those might be the things that I'll define both with line and also with some of these contrasts. I'm putting on some lighter colour in certain places and one or two patterns of shadow. And I did make a little bit for the table, just to finish. So we'll have our last session in the studio on Monday, and hopefully people will be able to go further with what is a dry painting, and the task will be perhaps to restate some of the emphasis that was in your original idea for the composition of the workshop. Cheerio.